A clay cylinder, roughly the size of a man's fist, changes everything we think we know about the ancient world. Pulled from the ground in Babylon in 1879, it contains a proclamation from Cyrus the Great, and it reads nothing like what you would expect from a conqueror. No threats, no demands of submission. Instead, Cyrus tells the people of Babylon that their gods have chosen him, that he has come to free them, that their religious practices will be protected, and that the peoples his armies displaced will be allowed to go home. The Jews among them would later call him the Anointed One, a pagan Persian king. The Greeks, meanwhile, were busy writing a very different story, one of whip-cracking despots driving slave armies into battle, of barbarian hordes threatening the civilized world. That story became the story. It shaped how we see Persia even now. But what if the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen was built not on terror, but on something far more radical and far more fragile? What happens when the system that made you unbeatable becomes the reason you fall? And while you are down there, I would love to know, was the Persian Empire's tolerance its greatest strength, or the very thing that made it impossible to defend? But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. A clay cylinder, roughly the size of a man's fist, comes out of the ground in Babylon in 1879. The men who find it are professional excavators employed by the British Museum, and they are good at their work in the way that people become good at things they do every day without ceremony. They catalogue it, they wrap it, they ship it west. It is, to all outward appearances, a modest object, baked clay, dense with cuneiform script pressed into its curved surface in the neat, wedge-shaped impressions of a dead administrative language. It does not look like something that should change the way a person thinks about power. When scholars finally decode what it says, they sit with it for a moment. Then they sit with it a little longer, because what the cylinder says, what this fist-sized piece of ancient clay announces, in the careful bureaucratic language of the 6th century before the Common Era, is that a conqueror has arrived, and he has come not to destroy, but to restore. He has come to return displaced peoples to their homelands. He has come to rebuild the temples his predecessors neglected. He has come, in his own telling, as the chosen instrument of the city's own god, correcting a lapse in divine order rather than imposing a foreign will. He has come, in other words, as something that has no business existing in the ancient world, a conqueror who is also, by formal declaration, a liberator. His name is Cyrus. And the gap between what that cylinder says and what most people believe about ancient empire is the entire subject of what follows. To understand what Cyrus walks into in 539 BC, it helps to stand inside Babylon for a moment and look up. The city is not a ruin. It is not in obvious decline. It is, by any honest measure, the greatest metropolis in the ancient world. A place of such staggering scale that later visitors will struggle to describe it without sounding like they are inventing things. Its walls are wide enough at the top to race chariots along their length. The Euphrates runs through its center, crossed by stone bridges, lined with quays where the commerce of half the known world unloads itself every morning. The great ziggurat of Marduk rises at the city's heart, a stepped mountain of brick and ambition that seeds every Tower of Babel story ever told, in every culture that encounters it. Babylon is not a city that expects to fall. Babylon is a city that expects to be eternal. Its problem in the year 539 is narrower and more human than decline. Its problem has a name, Nabonidus. Nabonidus is not a monster. That distinction matters, and it is worth pausing on, because the temptation when a great civilization stumbles is to reach for a villain, someone whose cruelty or stupidity explains the catastrophe that follows. Nabonidus does not oblige that narrative. He is, by the evidence available to us, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity, an antiquarian who takes a serious interest in the religious history of Mesopotamia, a king who spends long stretches of his reign at the oasis city of Timar in Arabia, pursuing what appear to be theological investigati, eons of personal importance to him. He is, in other words, a man who has allowed his private enthusiasms to eat his political judgment whole. The specific enthusiasm that destroys him is his devotion to the moon god Sin, whom he elevates above Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, the god whose priestly establishment constitutes the city's most powerful institutional force, the god whose annual ritual endorsement of the king is not a seer. Monial nicety, but the literal theological foundation of royal legitimacy. By neglecting Marduk's New Year festival, by absenting himself from the city for years at a stretch, by repositioning the divine hierarchy in ways the Babylonian priesthood finds both theologically offensive and professionally threatening, Nabonidus manages the remarkable feat of making himself politically radioactive to the very people whose support he cannot govern without. This is the city Cyrus approaches, not a city of broken walls and desperate people, a city of intact walls and a furious clergy. Cyrus himself, at this moment, is already a figure of considerable achievement and considerable myth, and with Cyrus, it is sometimes genuinely difficult to separate the two, because he is a man who understands, with a sophistication that feels almost anachronistic, that myth is a form of infrastructure. He is the son of a Persian chieftain, a member of the Achaemenid clan, raised on the windswept plateau south of the Zagros Mountains, among a people who are, at the middle of the 6th century, not yet remarkable. The Persians pay tribute to the Medes. They keep their heads down. The world does not expect much from them. And then, around 550 BC, Cyrus moves against his maternal grandfather, the Median king Astyages, and everything changes. Not primarily through military force, but through something more interesting. Astyages is unpopular. His generals read the wind. His army dissolves before a proper battle is fought, and Cyrus enters the Median capital of Ecbatana, not trailing blood, but trailing a story. The story is one of continuity. He does not dismantle Median culture, he absorbs it. He wears its crown alongside his own, and the Medes, for the most part, accept the arrangement, because the arrangement is careful to cost them as little dignity as possible. That instinct, the instinct to conquer by absorption rather than annihilation, to make the defeated feel that they have been restored rather than erased, is the move that defines everything Cyrus does afterward. It is also the move that makes him genuinely difficult to categorize. He is operating in an era in which conquerors routinely deport entire populations, smash the cult statues of defeated gods, and rename everything in sight. Cyrus does the opposite. He sends the statues home. He learns the correct theological language of every city he enters. He presents himself with what must have required considerable preparation and considerable nerve as the man each city's own god has been waiting for. When he turns toward Babylon, the groundwork is already being laid by people who have no particular loyalty to Persia, but a great deal of grievance against Nabonidus. The priests of Marduk are, by this point, actively looking for an alternative. What Cyrus offers them is not conquest. It is a transaction. He will honor Marduk. He will restore the festivals. He will be, in the formal theological sense that Babylonian political culture requires, a legitimate king, which is to say, a king endorsed by the right god in the right ceremony at the right time of year. In exchange, the priests will open the gates. The gates open. Cyrus enters Babylon in October of 539 BC to what the Babylonian chronicles describe as public acclaim. He does not sack the temples. He funds them. He does not parade prisoners through the streets. He walks through the Ishtar Gate, that extraordinary structure of glazed blue brick, its surface alive with lions and dragons rendered in a color so vivid It still startles visitors in Berlin, where the gate now stands. And he presents himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a correction, an adjustment. The god's own chosen instrument, arriving to set right what Nabonidus got wrong. And then he does something that has, in the 25 centuries since, never entirely lost its power to astonish. He issues the cylinder. The language of the Cyrus Cylinder is not the language of triumph. It is the language of administration. Careful, formal, specific. It announces that peoples deported from their homelands will be permitted to return. That the cult statues of gods, removed to Babylon by previous kings, will be sent back to their original temples. That destroyed sanctuaries will be rebuilt. That the gods of conquered nations deserve respect rather than ridicule. These are not, in the ancient Near Eastern context, purely abstract principles. They are operational commitments, backed by the resources of the largest empire the world has yet seen. Among the peoples who take Cyrus at his word are the Jews. Those in Babylonian exile since the campaigns of Nebuchadnezzar, living in a foreign city beside rivers where, as their own poetry records, they sit down and weep when they remember Zion. Cyrus permits them to go home. He funds the rebuilding of their temple. They remember him in the Hebrew scriptures as the Lord's anointed, a foreign king who nevertheless served divine purpose, a conqueror who somehow arrived as a fulfillment rather than a punishment. This is an extraordinary thing for any tradition to say about any outsider, and the fact that they say it about Cyrus is a measure of how genuinely different his approach was from everything that surrounded it. The principle the cylinder articulates, that a ruler has obligations to the people he governs, that religious diversity is a political asset rather than a threat, that legitimacy derives from consent as much as from force, will not be formally articulated again in political thought for roughly 2 millennia. It will not find its way back into the official language of governance until the Enlightenment begins fumbling toward it in the 1600s and 1700s, in a Europe that has largely forgotten Cyrus exists. The cylinder is not a constitution. It is not a Bill of Rights in any modern sense. But it is something. It is a conqueror who thought in writing about what he owed the people he had just conquered. In the 6th century before the Common Era, that is not nothing. That is almost everything. The object itself sits today in the British Museum, in a case in the ancient Iran Gallery, a few rooms away from the Elgin marbles and the Rosetta Stone, objects that draw longer queues and more photographs. It is still roughly the size of a man's fist. It is still covered in the same dense cuneiform script that the excavators of 1879 shipped west without fully understanding. Visitors walk past it with the mild, polite attention that museum visitors extend to things they cannot immediately read, and then they move on to something with more visual drama. They are moving past the wrong thing, because what the cylinder represents, what it stands in for, what it announces the existence of, is an empire that stretches, at its height, from the Aegean coast to the edges of the Indian subcontinent. An empire that governs more human beings than any political entity before it, and does so not primarily through terror, but through a system of administrative sophistication that the ancient world will not see again for centuries. An empire founded by a semi-nomadic people from a windswept Iranian plateau that the rest of the ancient world, as recently as a generation before Cyrus, considered provincial and unremarkable. An empire that will, despite everything, despite its eventual collapse, despite the burning of its greatest ceremonial city by a young Macedonian king in 330 BC, leave its fingerprints on every administrative system that follows it, Seleucid, Parthian, Sasanian, Islamic, in ways that are still, if you know where to look, visible in the world today. The question that this story will spend its full length trying to answer is deceptively simple. How did they do it? How did a people this sophisticated, this genuinely innovative in their thinking about power and legitimacy and governance get remembered so badly? How did the civilization that produced the Cyrus Cylinder, that sat down in the 6th century BC and thought seriously about what a ruler owes his subjects, end up in the Western imagination primarily as the villains of a Greek story, as the faceless Eastern horde that Leonidas and his 300 died to stop? The answer has everything to do with who got to write the history, and almost nothing to do with what actually happened. The Greeks were magnificent writers, the Persians were magnificent administrators, and in the long competition between those two skill sets for control of the historical record, the writers won decisively. But the cylinder is still there. It is still waiting to be properly read. And what it says, once you stop walking past it, is that the story we think we know about the ancient world, about power and conquest and the relationship between civilization and force, is missing something large and consequential at its center. It is missing Persia. We begin, then, at the beginning. To understand what Cyrus built, you first have to understand what the world looked like before he arrived. And the world before he arrived looks, to modern eyes, both familiar and deeply strange. The ancient Near East in the early 6th century BC is a system of competing powers that have been jostling for dominance for so long that the jostling itself has become a kind of stability, each empire knowing roughly where the others will push back and calibrating their ambitions accordingly. It is a world of walls and tribute and gods who are, in the political theology of the time, as real and consequential as armies. The center of this world, by almost any measure, is Babylon. Stand on the banks of the Euphrates in 600 BC and look east into the city, and you are looking at the largest, most deliberately impressive urban space on Earth. The walls are wide enough to drive a chariot along the top. The Ishtar Gate, faced in glazed blue brick and decorated with dragons and bulls in relief, announces to every arriving traveler that this is not merely a city, but a statement, a claim about the nature of civilization itself and who, precisely, is in charge of it. The Babylonians have been making this claim for a very long time. They know how to make it convincingly. Their astronomical records stretch back centuries. Their legal traditions, codified under Hammurabi 1,000 years earlier, still organize daily life with a precision that most of their neighbors cannot match. When Babylon lends money, and Babylon always lends money, the contracts are written in cuneiform on clay tablets and stored in archives that will outlast the city by 2.5 millennia. Babylon is not merely wealthy. Babylon is institutional, the agricultural land that sustains it. The alluvial plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, that the Greeks will later call Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, is the most productive farmland in the ancient world. It does not require the gods to be generous. It requires only irrigation. And the Babylonians are engineers of irrigation, with a thoroughness that borders on obsession. Canals branch from the great rivers in a network so dense and carefully maintained that the land yields harvests that can feed not only a city but an empire. This is the material foundation of Babylonian power, and it is nearly unassailable. You cannot starve Babylon into submission. You cannot easily outproduce it. If you want to bring Babylon down, you have to find a crack somewhere else. In the theology, in the politics, in the relationship between a king and his priests. That crack will come, but not yet. At the western edge of the frame, almost beyond the reach of the narrative, sits Egypt. Egypt is in a category of its own, and Egypt knows it. By 600 BC, Egyptian civilization is already older than the interval between Cleopatra and the present day. It has absorbed the Hyksos, expelled them, built and rebuilt its monuments, watched a dozen foreign powers rise and fall on its borders, and concluded, with the serene confidence of something that has simply outlasted every alternative, that it will continue. The Egyptians are not naive about military power. They maintain armies. They negotiate alliances. They are perfectly capable of strategic cunning when strategic cunning is required. But there is a quality to Egyptian foreign policy in this period that can only be described as geological patience. Other civilizations exhaust themselves straining toward Egypt's level of antiquity. Egypt simply waits, certain that the next challenger will wear itself out on the desert margins just as the last one did. This confidence is not entirely misplaced. It is, however, about to be tested in ways that Egyptian theology has not quite prepared it for. Between these two anchors, Babylon to the east, Egypt to the west, the dominant military power of the early 6th century is neither. It is the Medes. The Medes are an Iranian people, highland warriors from the Zagros mountain range and the territories stretching north and east from it. And they have recently done something that the ancient world still cannot quite believe. They helped bring down Assyria. In 612 BC, in coalition with the Babylonians, the Medes sacked Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, the city that had ground empires to dust for 3 centuries, the city whose fall is recorded in the Hebrew Bible as an act of divine justice so complete that the prophet Nahum can barely contain his satisfaction. The Medes did not accomplish this alone, but they accomplished it, and the accomplishment has defined their self-image ever since. Median power radiates outward from its capital at Ecbatana, a city built on high ground in what is now northwestern Iran, cool in summer and brutal in winter. A city whose physical elevation seems to mirror the political attitude of its rulers. The Median king Astyages, who comes to the throne around 585 BC, presides over a highland empire stretching from the edges of Anatolia in the west to the approaches of Central Asia in the east. His court is sophisticated, his military reach is substantial, and his political relationships with the powers around him are managed with a practiced confidence. He is, by any reasonable assessment of the early 6th century, the man to watch. The dominant player, the one whose next move everyone else is calculating. He is also, though he does not yet know it, a man whose dynasty is approximately 40 years from extinction. Now, south of the Zagros, on the plateau that the Persians call home, we find a people who are, at this moment in history, almost entirely uninteresting. This is not an insult. It is simply the truth, as any informed observer of the period would have recorded it. The Persians are an Iranian people, culturally and linguistically related to the Medes, settled across the region known as Fars or Parsa, a high, dry, windswept plateau in what is now southwestern Iran. They are semi-nomadic in tradition, pastoral in economy, and tribal in political organization, though the word tribal undersells the sophistication of their kinship networks and the complexity of their internal hierarchies. They worship the natural forces, fire and water and sky, in ways that will eventually be systematized into the theology of Zoroaster, though that systematization is still, in 600 BC, contested and incomplete. They are not illiterate, they are not primitive, but they are not, by the standards of the ancient Near East, remarkable. They pay tribute to the Medes. This is the essential fact of Persian political life in the early 6th century. The Median king is their overlord, and the Persians are his subjects, contributing to his treasury and his military campaigns and his court. This is a common arrangement in the ancient world, and it does not, on the surface, carry any particular resentment with it. Subject peoples pay tribute. That is what subject peoples do. The Persians are no different. Except, perhaps, in this, they are watching. A Persian nobleman of the early 6th century who finds himself at the Median court in Ecbatana is not merely a vassal performing an obligation. He is a student, whether he thinks of himself that way or not. He is watching how an empire administers itself, how tribute is collected and distributed, how provincial loyalty is maintained, how the king's legitimacy is constructed and performed, how the relationship between a ruler and the gods he claims to serve is managed as a political instrument. He is absorbing, without necessarily intending to, the entire grammar of imperial governance. The Medes are teaching the Persians how to run an empire. They will not enjoy the irony of this later. The Persian nobility intermarries with the Median aristocracy. This is also common practice in the ancient world, a way of cementing alliances, managing succession, binding the periphery to the center. A Median princess marries into the Persian royal house. Her son grows up bilingual, bicultural, with a foot in both worlds and a claim, depending on how you count it, to both thrones. This is not unusual. This is how the ancient world works. The son is named Cambyses. He rules the Persians as a vassal king under Median suzerainty, a minor figure in a minor position, and his son will be named Cyrus. Herodotus, writing a century and a half later, tells us that before Cyrus is born, his grandfather Astyages has a dream. In the dream, a vine grows from his daughter's womb and covers all of Asia. The dream interpreters are summoned. They are not encouraging. Astyages, as kings in such stories reliably do, attempts to prevent the prophecy from fulfilling itself, and, as kings in such stories reliably discover, his attempts become the mechanism of his own undoing. The details of the Herodotian version: the infant exposed on a hillside, the shepherd who disobeys, the discovery, the revenge. Read as the ancient world's way of announcing that something world historical is about to happen, that the birth of a particular child is not merely a biological event, a cosmological one. We should treat this story with appropriate skepticism, which is to say with appropriate respect. It is not biography. It is almost certainly not history in any strict sense, but it is evidence. Evidence of how the ancient world understood the arrival of Cyrus, evidence of the scale of retroactive astonishment that his career generated, evidence that even within his own lifetime, the story of his birth was being shaped into myth. A man whose grandfather tries to kill him and whose destiny cannot be thwarted is not merely a king, he is a narrative. And the ability to become a narrative, to have your life understood as the fulfillment of something larger than a single human ambition, is, in the 6th century BC, a form of political power that no army can easily defeat. He is not yet born when this chapter finds him. Or rather, he is just born, an infant on the plateau of Fars, beneath skies that are indifferent to prophecy, in a world that has arranged itself into what it believes are permanent categories. The Medes are dominant. Babylon is rich. Egypt is eternal. The Persians are peripheral. The world of 600 BC is a world that believes it knows its own shape, that the Medes will remain dominant, that Babylon will remain rich, that Egypt will remain eternal, and that the Persians will remain peripheral. It is wrong on every count. The last image of this chapter is not a battle or a throne room, but a plateau, the windswept, spare landscape of Fars province in southern Iran, where a people are living quietly inside a political arrangement that is about to become intolerable to one man among them. The wind, at least, is unchanged. That man's name is Cyrus, and the first thing to understand about him is that he does not begin with an army. He begins with a story. The story is this: he is not, properly speaking, a usurper. His mother is Mandane, daughter of Astyages, king of the Medes. His father is Cambyses I, a Persian chieftain of the Achaemenid line. He is, by blood, the junction point of two royal houses, and when he moves against his grandfather around 550 BC, he is not asking the world to accept a revolution. He is asking it to accept a correction. The throne of the Medes, he implies, was always going to come to him eventually. He is merely accelerating the schedule. It is a brilliant story. It is also, in the way of all brilliant political stories, precisely impossible to verify and precisely irrelevant whether or not it is true. What matters is that enough people believe it, or find it convenient to believe it, or simply decide that a man offering continuity and competence is preferable to a king who has, by most accounts, become erratic, cruel, and, perhaps most damning of all, unlucky in his dreams. Astyages is the kind of ruler whose advisors have begun calculating exit strategies. His court is a place of private calculations made behind careful faces, and when Cyrus moves his forces northward toward the Median heartland, the calculation reaches its conclusion. The Median general Harpagus. And here, history gives us a name to attach to the defection, which is generous of it, crosses to Cyrus's side with a significant portion of the Median army. Herodotus, who will tell this story 2 centuries later with his characteristic mixture of careful inquiry and magnificent embellishment, suggests that Harpagus has personal reasons for his betrayal, a long-nursed grievance against Astyages stretching back years. This may be true. Grievances are real, and men act on them. But Harpagus does not defect alone, and the soldiers who follow him do not all share his personal history. What they share is a judgment, a cold, almost administrative judgment that Cyrus is the stronger bet, that the Median Empire under its current management is a declining asset, and that the man coming toward them from the south carries himself like someone who knows how this ends. The battle, when it happens, is barely a battle. Astyages' remaining forces engage, are overrun, and the king himself is captured. He is not executed. He is not paraded in chains. He is treated, by the accounts that survive, with a courtesy that is itself a message directed not at Astyages, who is finished regardless, but at every other king in the ancient Near East who is watching and wondering what kind of conqueror this is. The answer Cyrus is broadcasting, in the treatment of a defeated grandfather, is this: I am the kind who does not require your humiliation, only your cooperation. He enters Ecbatana, the Median capital, and he does not sack it. This bears repeating, because in the world of 550 BC, sacking is very much the default. The ancient Near East runs on a grammar of conquest that is largely written in fire. Cities are taken, temples are looted, populations are deported. The victorious king stands before the ruins and has his scribes record, in careful cuneiform, the extent of the destruction. Because destruction is proof of power, and power is the only currency that matters. This is how it has been done for as long as there have been kings to do it. It is the tradition. It is, one might say, the industry standard. Cyrus declines to follow it. He does not replace Median officials with Persian ones. He does not dissolve the Median administrative apparatus and rebuild it from scratch. He absorbs it, whole, largely intact, functioning, into a new structure that is, from the perspective of the officials who staff it, remarkably similar to the old one, except that the man at the top now wears 2 crowns instead of 1. The Median nobility retains its titles. The Median bureaucrats retain their positions. The Median gods retain their temples. What changes is the name on the seal and the direction from which tribute flows. It is, if one is inclined toward the vocabulary of commercial enterprise, less a hostile takeover than a merger in which the acquiring party has the unusual grace to make the acquired party feel that the arrangement is somehow to their advantage. The effect is immediate and structural. The Median Empire does not rebel. It does not require pacification. It does not drain resources and soldiers in the grinding work of suppression that typically follows conquest. It simply becomes, with a minimum of friction, the northern and western foundation of something larger, a platform from which Cyrus can now turn his attention to the next calculation, and the one after that. The pattern, once established, repeats. Westward, into Anatolia, where the kingdom of Lydia sits astride the trade routes that connect the Aegean world to the interior of Asia Minor. The Lydian king Croesus is, by the middle of the 6th century, the wealthiest man in the known world, or at least the man most reliably associated with the concept of wealth, so thoroughly that his name becomes, in later ages, the shorthand for it. He controls the electrum deposits of the Pactolus River. He has refined the technology of coinage to a degree that makes Lydia the financial hub of its region. He is rich in the specific, structural way that generates more richness, through trade infrastructure, through merchant networks, through the accumulated trust of a monetary system that people actually believe in. Croesus consults the oracle at Delphi before moving against Cyrus, which suggests he is prudent. The oracle tells him that if he crosses the Halys River, he will destroy a great empire. He crosses the river. The oracle is, as usual, correct in its ambiguity and useless in its specificity. The empire he destroys is his own. What is significant is not the defeat of Croesus, which is militarily unremarkable, but what Cyrus does with Lydia afterward. The trade networks survive. The coinage infrastructure survives. The merchants who built their livelihoods on Lydian monetary systems find, to their probable relief, that the new administration has no interest in dismantling the apparatus that generates the revenue it now intends to collect. Cyrus is not indifferent to wealth. He is simply intelligent about where wealth comes from. It comes from functioning systems. Destroy the system to punish the king, and you have punished yourself. This is the logic, practical, almost tediously practical, that runs beneath every military campaign Cyrus prosecutes. The goal is never destruction. The goal is acquisition, and acquisition requires that the thing acquired retain its value. Eastward, the empire extends into Bactria and Sogdia, the Central Asian territories that will, for millennia, serve as the hinge between the sedentary civilizations to the west and the nomadic worlds of the steppe. These are not rich territories in the Lydian sense. They are strategic territories, corridors of movement and influence, and Cyrus incorporates them with the same method: local governance retained, local customs respected, the administrative machinery of the previous arrangement repurposed rather than replaced. Each successful absorption funds the next. Each new territory brought in without a prolonged pacification campaign frees resources for the campaign after. The momentum is self-generating. An empire that does not have to spend its strength suppressing the territories it already holds can always find strength for the territories it does not yet hold. There is a word for what Cyrus is doing, and the word is legitimacy. He is not simply conquering. He is constructing a theory of rule in real time, testing it against reality and finding that it works. The theory is this: a king who presents himself as the continuation of existing order rather than its disruption, who speaks the language of each people's own political theology, who allows the conquered to tell themselves a story in which they have not been defeated but merely reorganized. That king does not face the resistance that other kings face. He faces, instead, something closer to acceptance. And acceptance, in the long run, is cheaper than garrison troops. This is not sentimentality. It should not be mistaken for sentimentality. Cyrus is not kind in the modern therapeutic sense of the word. He is precise. There is a difference, and the difference matters. When Cyrus spares Astyages, he is not moved by family feeling, or if he is, family feeling and strategic calculation happen to point in the same direction, which is the best kind of decision-making. When he preserves Lydian trade infrastructure, he is not concerned with the welfare of Lydian merchants. He is concerned with revenue. The mercy and the pragmatism are inseparable, and the inseparability is the point. An empire that is profitable to maintain is an empire that maintains itself. He stands at Ecbatana, wearing both crowns, and the image carries its own particular weight. He is Persian and Median simultaneously, not as a compromise, not as a diplomatic fiction, but as a fact of birth that the political moment has suddenly made useful. His dual heritage, which might in another life have made him marginal to both peoples, has become the mechanism of his legitimacy. He is not a foreigner imposing Persian rule on the Medes. He is the Medes' own king, restored to a throne that was always, in some genealogical sense, his. The story holds because the blood is real, and the blood is real because his grandfather made a political marriage a generation earlier that nobody at the time imagined would produce this. History is frequently like this. The contingency is the point. The question that hangs over the image of Cyrus at Ecbatana, receiving tribute from both peoples, looking east and west and south at a world that is, with startling speed, becoming his, is whether the man is as extraordinary as the story he is generating, or whether the story has, by now, begun to run slightly ahead of the man. Myths about Cyrus are already forming, while Cyrus is still alive to observe them. The oracle traditions, the divine favor narratives, the accounts of his miraculous preservation as an infant, these are not posthumous inventions. They're contemporary political tools, and Cyrus, or the people around him, are clearly aware of their utility. A king who is fated to rule is a king whose subjects have been given a theological reason to stop resisting. But there is also, underneath the myth, something that resists reduction to pure calculation. The pattern of absorption rather than destruction is too consistent, too instinctive, too present, even in moments when pure force would have been equally effective, to be entirely explained by strategic logic. There is something in Cyrus's approach to power that looks, at its edges, like genuine curiosity. A curiosity about how other peoples organize themselves, what they believe, what makes their systems function. He is not merely tolerant, he is, in some sense, interested. And interest, in a ruler of vast territories, is a rarer quality than courage, or intelligence, or even competence. He is not finished. The greatest act of his reign has not yet occurred. To the southwest, beyond the Zagros Mountains and the Arabian Desert, the city of Babylon sits in its ancient certainty, enormous and wealthy, and governed by a king whose relationship with his own gods has become, by all accounts, complicated. The priests of Marduk are restless. The people of the Fertile Crescent are watching the horizon. And Cyrus, standing at Ecbatana with 2 crowns on his head and a method that has not yet failed him, is already calculating the story he will need to tell when he arrives at Babylon's gates. A story about a servant of Marduk, a liberator of the oppressed, a king who comes not to conquer, but to restore. The city does not yet know it is waiting for him, but it is waiting. The city that Cyrus approaches in 539 BC is not simply large. It is, by the standards of the ancient world, almost incomprehensibly large. A metropolis of perhaps 200,000 people enclosed by walls that Herodotus will later describe, with his characteristic blend of accuracy and exaggeration, as wide enough to turn a 4-horse chariot on top of. This is not a city in any sense that most of the ancient world takes for granted. It is something closer to a category error. A place so densely inhabited, so intricately organized, so layered with centuries of accumulated civilization that the mind reaching for comparison finds none and simply stops. The Euphrates runs through the middle of Babylon, bisecting it with the indifferent authority of a river that has been doing exactly this since before writing was invented. On either bank, the city unfolds in grids of mud brick and fired clay, in markets and temples and administrative compounds, in neighborhoods where Babylonians and Arameans and Egyptians and Lydians and Jews live within the same walls, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, conducting their commerce in a babel of tongues that the city absorbs without apparent difficulty. Babylon has always been this, a place that swallows peoples without destroying them, a city capacious enough to contain multitudes. There are canals. There are processional avenues wide enough to accommodate entire armies of priests on feast days. There is the Ishtar Gate, glazed in brilliant blue, its lions and dragons shimmering in the Mesopotamian sun with a confidence that says, without ambiguity, whatever else may be temporary in this world, this is not. And above all of it, pressing against the sky with the unhurried authority of something built not for a generation but for eternity, rises the ziggurat of Marduk, Etemenanki, the Babylonians call it, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It is, in the religious imagination of the ancient Near East, not merely a building. It is the axis around which the world turns, the point at which the divine and the human make their necessary contact. And Marduk, great Marduk, Lord of Lords, the god who, in Babylonian cosmology, defeats the chaos monster Tiamat and fashions the world from her body. Marduk is the one whose favor a Babylonian king cannot afford to lose. Not because theology demands it in the abstract, but because the priesthood that administers that theology is also the institution that controls the temple granaries, the commercial networks, the ritual calendar, and a substantial portion of the urban population's daily life. To have the priests of Marduk on your side is to have Babylon. To lose them is to lose everything else by slow degrees. Nabonidus has lost them. He is not, it should be said, a stupid man. He is not even, by the standards of the ancient Near East, a cruel one. He is something more interesting and, for his purposes, more dangerous. He is a theological eccentric in a position that requires rigorous theological conformity. He has spent years, actual years, in the Arabian desert at the oasis of Timar, leaving Babylon in the care of his son Belshazzar while he pursues what appears to be a genuine religious fascination with the moon god Sin. He has elevated Sin above Marduk in the official cult in a way that the Marduk priesthood finds somewhere between heretical and personally insulting. He has neglected the Akitu festival, the great New Year ceremony in which the king grasps the hands of Marduk's statue and ritually renews the covenant between heaven and Babylon, and in doing so has left that covenant, in the theology of his own civilization, unrenewed, the city's divine legitima, suspended in an uncomfortable void. The priests have been watching this for years. They have been recording it in their chronicles with the careful, restrained fury of bureaucrats who know that documentation is its own form of power. And when the Persian army appears on the horizon, the Marduk priesthood makes a calculation. It is not a complicated calculation. On one side, a king who has spent years in the desert, who neglects the rituals, who elevates the wrong god, who has left the divine machinery of the city running without proper maintenance. On the other side, a conqueror who has, in every city he has taken, presented himself as the servant of the local god, the restorer of right order, the man the deity chose when the previous king proved unworthy. The calculation resolves itself with the cold efficiency of a temple accounting ledger. The Persian campaign against Babylon is, by the standards of ancient conquest, barely a campaign at all. Cyrus defeats a Babylonian force at Opis in a battle that is real enough. There is fighting, there is blood. But what follows is not the grinding siege that a city of Babylon's fortifications might be expected to require. The ancient sources offer two versions of what happens next, and the documentary tradition, which prizes honesty over tidiness, should let both stand. Herodotus tells us that Cyrus diverts the Euphrates upstream, reducing the river's flow through the city to a depth his soldiers can wade, and that Persian troops enter Babylon through the riverbed while the city's inhabitants are occupied with a festival, oblivious to what is happening in the dark. Water beneath the walls. Xenophon tells a similar story. The Babylonian chronicles, which have no particular reason to flatter Cyrus, suggest something simpler and in its way more devastating, that the gates simply open. That Babylon, its priests already in quiet negotiation with the Persian advance, does not so much fall as exhale. Whether Cyrus wades through the river or walks through the gate, the result is the same. He enters the city on the 12th of October, 539 BC, and the city does not burn. This requires a moment. The city does not burn. In an era when the sack of a captured city is so routine that it barely merits comment in the chronicles, when the deportation of a defeated population is standard administrative practice, when the melting down of a conquered god's statues is considered not cruelty but common sense. In this era, Rus enters the greatest city in the world and does not burn it. He walks to the temple of Marduk. He performs the hand-clasping ceremony, the ritual by which a king takes the god's hands and in doing so accepts the god's authority and the god's mandate. He becomes, in the political theology of Babylon, a legitimate king, not a conqueror who happens to be ruling. A legitimate king. The priests who have spent years waiting for exactly this moment receive him with what the chronicles describe as peace and joy. Whether there is genuine joy or merely professional satisfaction is a question the chronicles do not address. Then he issues the proclamation. It is baked into a clay cylinder, roughly the size of a man's forearm, written in Babylonian cuneiform, and it says, in the careful, formal language of royal self-presentation, that Marduk looked upon the lands and searched among all the kings for a righteous ruler and found Cyrus of Anshan and Cyrus of Anshan, called him by name and appointed him to rule all the world. It says that Nabonidus was an unfit king who had brought ruin upon his people. It says that Cyrus has brought peace to Babylon, that he has freed the inhabitants from their burden, that he has restored the gods of the surrounding lands to their sanctuaries, and that the peoples who had been deported and displaced will be permitted to return to their homes. The Cyrus Cylinder is propaganda. Let us say so plainly, in the affectionate candor that this story deserves. It is the work of a sophisticated political operation that understood, with remarkable clarity, how power is legitimized and how legitimacy is maintained. Cyrus did not compose it alone in a moment of humanitarian inspiration. The Marduk priesthood almost certainly had a hand in its language, its theology, its framing. It presents Cyrus in the idiom that Babylonian political theology requires, which is to say, it presents him as what Babylon needed him to be. It is not a neutral document. It is a statement of intent crafted to serve the interests of the man who issues it. And yet there is a distinction that matters enormously, a distinction that the 25 centuries separating us from this cylinder have not made obsolete. Propaganda that commits a ruler to specific, checkable actions is not the same thing as empty flattery. A declaration that says the gods will be respected, the temples rebuilt, the deported peoples returned. A declaration like that creates obligations. It creates witnesses. It creates, in the peoples who hear it and act upon it, a set of expectations that a king who wishes to be believed in the next city and the city after that cannot afford to violate. Cyrus follows through. The looted sacred vessels of the Babylonian temples are returned. The statues of the gods that had been removed are carried back to their sanctuaries. And the peoples who had been deported, carried from their homelands by Babylonian policy, settled in Mesopotamia to serve the needs of an empire that did not ask their preference, are told they may go home. Among those peoples are the Jews. They have been in Babylonian exile for decades, since Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 5086 BC and carried the population of Judah into captivity. They have kept their identity, their language, their scriptures, their theology, with the stubborn tenacity of a people who understand that identity is what survives when everything else is taken. And now Cyrus tells them they may go back. More than that, he instructs that the sacred vessels of the temple, taken by Nebuchadnezzar, be returned to them for the journey. He authorizes the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. He does not merely permit the Jews to leave, he actively facilitates their return. The Hebrew Bible calls Cyrus the Lord's anointed, Mashiach, the anointed one. In the book of Isaiah, the prophet addresses Cyrus directly in the voice of God. I have called thee by thy name, I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. This is the language reserved in Hebrew scripture for the greatest of kings, for the men through whom God acts in history. And Cyrus is the only foreign king in all of Hebrew scripture to receive this designation. Not because the biblical authors are careless with their theology, but because the gratitude is real. The gratitude is earned. A people who expected to remain in exile indefinitely are going home, and the man who made that possible is a Persian king who worships no god in particular and every god in practice. The irony is too human to require commentary. The Jews who return to Jerusalem carry the memory of Cyrus with them. They carry it into their scriptures, into their prayers, into the story they tell about who they are and how they were saved. That memory will survive the Persian Empire by 2.5 millennia. It will survive the Macedonian conquest and the Seleucid kingdom and the Roman destruction of the Second Temple and every catastrophe that follows. The Cyrus Cylinder will not be the reason. Scripture is the reason, and memory is the reason. But the cylinder and the scripture are pointing at the same thing, a moment in 539 BC when a conqueror chose, with clear eyes and deliberate intent, to be something other than what conquerors usually are. There is a phrase that historians use carefully, with the appropriate qualifications attached: the first declaration of human rights. The Cyrus Cylinder is often called this, and the calling is not entirely wrong, though it requires the qualifications. It is not a universal declaration in the modern sense. It does not envision rights that belong to every human being by virtue of being human. It is addressed to specific peoples in specific circumstances by a king with specific political interests. But it establishes, in writing, on clay, under the authority of the greatest empire the world has yet seen, that a ruler's legitimacy is connected to his treatment of the people he rules, that conquered peoples deserve to worship their own gods, that displaced peoples deserve to go home, that the relationship between a king and his subjects involves obligations that run in both directions. These are not small ideas. They are, in fact, among the largest ideas the ancient world produces, and they are produced here, in Babylon, by a Persian king who understands that the most durable form of power is the kind that people choose to accept. Cyrus leaves Babylon richer, more populous, and more functional than he found it. That is a sentence that can be said about almost no conqueror in the ancient record. He does not reduce it. He does not diminish it. He walks into the greatest city in the world and makes it part of something larger without destroying what made it great. The priests of Marduk continue their ceremonies. The merchants continue their commerce. The neighborhoods of the city continue their polyglot, multicultural, entirely ordinary life. The walls remain. The ziggurat remains. The Ishtar Gate continues to gleam in the sun, its dragons and lions indifferent to the change of administration. And under a foundation wall, sealed in clay, the cylinder is buried. It will remain there, undisturbed, for 2,500 years, through the rise and fall of empires that cannot yet be imagined, through the slow accumulation of rubble and sand that covers every great city if you wait long enough, through the arrival of conquerors who do not trouble to rear. D. The language in which it is written. British excavators will find it in 1879, in the ruins of what was once the greatest city in the world, and they will carry it to London, and scholars will read it, and the world will understand, perhaps for the first time, what kind of empire this was at its best, what it aspired to, what it claimed. D for itself, what it, in this particular instance, actually delivered. We began this story with that cylinder. We return to it now, having seen the man who made it and the moment that required it, and the circle that closes here is not a neat one. History does not do neat, but it is a real one. The object that opens our story is also the object that most precisely defines what this empire chose to say. It stood for not conquest, not domination, not the erasure of everything that came before. Something more ambitious and more difficult and ultimately more fragile, the idea that an empire could be held together not by force alone, but by the consent of the peoples it contained. Cyrus leaves Babylon in the autumn of 539 BC and turns his attention back to the frontiers, east and north, and the endless horizon of the steppe, where problems are waiting that cannot be solved by political theology or clay declarations. The empire he is building is the largest the world has ever seen, and it rests at its foundation on a set of promises. The next question, the question that will occupy the remaining chapters of this story, is whether those promises can outlast the man who made them. whether the system survives the genius, whether Persia, which has just demonstrated something remarkable about what power can choose to be, can find a way to remain what it has in this extraordinary autumn briefly become. The answer, it turns out, comes sooner than anyone expects. And it comes not from within the empire, not from a rebellious satrap or a disgruntled priest or a rival claimant nursing old grievances in some provincial palace. It comes from the northeast, from the steppe, from a direction that the Persian administrative imagination has not yet fully mapped, because the people who live there have no interest in being mapped. There is a version of Cyrus's story in which he dies peacefully, surrounded by his achievements, having built the largest empire the world had yet seen, and governed it with a wisdom that his successors will spend generations failing to match. The empire stretches from the Aegean coast to the edge of the Indian subcontinent. The roads run straight and well maintained. The post riders carry messages faster than rumor. Babylon is content. The Jews are home. The king sleeps easily. That is not the version that happened. What happened is that Cyrus, somewhere on the northeastern frontier of his empire around 530 BC, ran into a problem that his particular genius, the genius of the persuasive narrative, the genius of absorbed legitimacy, the genius of turning the enemy into an ally before the battle is properly joined, was structurally unable to solve. He ran into someone who simply did not want what he was offering, and he did not, apparently, know what to do about that. The people are called the Massagetae. They live east of the Caspian Sea, on the great flat steppe that runs without interruption toward the rising sun, a landscape so vast and so indifferent to human ambition that it has, throughout history, swallowed armies whole and returned nothing. They are a nomadic people, skilled on horseback, organized around a mobility that makes them ungovernable by the standards of any settled empire. They cannot be taxed, they cannot be administered. There is no city to capture, no temple to respect, no priestly class to negotiate with, no population concentrated in one place long enough to receive the Persian offer of benevolent incorporation. They are, in the precise technical sense, outside the system, and their queen is Tomyris. Herodotus introduces her without ceremony, which is itself a kind of respect. She is the ruler of her people. She is not described as beautiful or mysterious or savage. She is described as competent. When Cyrus arrives at the Araxes River and begins making preparations to cross into her territory, she sends him a message. The message is worth quoting, or at least paraphrasing closely, because it has a quality that is almost bracing in its clarity. She tells him, "Stay on your side of the river, rule your own people, and tolerate the sight of me ruling mine. Or, if you are determined to test yourself against the Massagetae, stop making these preparations to cross. We will withdraw 3 days' journey from the river, and you may come to us. Or, if you prefer, you withdraw 3 days' journey, and we will come to you." That is the whole message. There is no flattery, there is no appeal to shared gods or mutual prosperity. There is no opening for negotiation. She is offering him a choice between two versions of a fight, or the option of not fighting at all. She is not posturing. Herodotus, who has a sharp eye for character even when his facts are questionable, clearly understands that this woman is not posturing. The audience should understand it too. Cyrus has spent 20 years encountering people who, when faced with his approach, found reasons to accommodate him. Generals who defected, priests who recognized him as divinely chosen, populations who preferred his rule to the rule they already had. Tomyris is not finding reasons. She is not looking for reasons. She has a coherent strategic position and the unusual clarity to state it in plain language, and she has no interest in the elaborate theater of legitimacy that Cyrus has always used to make conquest feel like something else. His advisors are divided. Croesus, the former king of Lydia, who has by this point become something of a court philosopher, the man who learned the hard way about the limits of wealth and the ambiguity of oracles, counsels against the campaign entirely. If you cross the river and lose, he says, you lose everything. If you cross and win, you have won a step. The calculation does not favor the venture. It is, in retrospect, excellent advice, the kind of advice that only a man who has already lost everything once can give with real conviction. Cyrus does not take it. What Cyrus does instead is characteristic. He devises a stratagem. He will cross the river, establish a forward camp, and then, here is the cleverness, abandon it. Not retreat, but withdraw in apparent disorder, leaving behind tents and supplies, and, crucially, large quantities of wine. The Massagetae are not a wine-drinking people. They will find the abandoned camp, they will find the wine, they will drink it, and they will be helpless. It is, as a piece of tactical thinking, not without elegance. It is the kind of move that has worked before, the kind of move that relies on knowing something about your enemy that they do not know you know. And it works, partially. A detachment of Massagetae warriors finds the camp. They drink the wine. They are captured. Among the captured is Spargapices, the son of Tomyris, the heir. The moment the situation becomes irreversible is not the capture itself. It is what happens next. Spargapices, sober again, and apparently understanding exactly what his capture means, what it will cost his mother, what it will cost her people, what position it places her in, asks for his bonds to be removed. Cyrus, in what may be a gesture of respect or may simply be a miscalculation, agrees. Spargapices, freed, kills himself. There is a second message from Tomyris. It is not like the first. The first message was an offer of alternatives. The second message is a statement of fact. She tells Cyrus, "You have your fill of blood. Give me back my son, and you may leave this country without harm. Refuse, and I swear by the sun, Lord of the Massagetae, that I will give you your fill of blood, glutton though you are." It is not a warning. Warnings imply that the outcome remains uncertain, that there is still something to negotiate. This is not that. This is a woman who has already decided what she is going to do, informing her opponent of the decision as a courtesy. Cyrus does not give back the son. The son is dead. And so the battle comes. Herodotus calls it the fiercest battle between foreigners that he has ever recorded. The Persians hold for a while, as the Persians generally do. They are not, at this point in their history, a people who lack military competence. But the Massagetae fight on ground they know, with a mobility the Persian infantry cannot match, with a ferocity that has nothing to do with discipline or strategy, and everything to do with something simpler and more absolute. Cyrus's army is destroyed. Cyrus himself is killed. The details of his death are not certain. The ancient sources offer several versions, which is itself a sign that no one who was there survived to give a clean account. Herodotus gives us the version that has the most staying power, the one that the audience is most likely to have encountered, and he gives it with what feels like a slight awareness of its dramatic perfection. Tomyris finds the body of Cyrus among the dead. She has a skin filled with human blood. She pushes his head into it. She says, "I warned you. Drink your fill." Whether this happened is, in the strictest sense, unknowable. Herodotus is a magnificent writer and an inconsistent historian, and he loves an ending that closes the circle. But here is the thing about this story, the thing that makes the question of its literal truth feel almost secondary. The symbolic logic is so exact that it almost doesn't matter. Cyrus built his empire on stories. He offered people narratives they wanted to believe. The liberator, the chosen servant, the righteous king who respects your gods and your customs and your dignity. He was, in the deepest sense, a man who conquered with words before he conquered with armies. A man whose genius was the genius of the persuasive offer, the story that made absorption feel like elevation. And he was stopped by a woman who refused to hear it, who sent him a plain message, who made him a plain offer. who, when he declined the offer, did exactly what she said she would do. A man who conquered the world with stories was stopped by a woman who would not listen to stories. That is either history or it is parable, and at this distance, the distinction may not be as important as we like to think. Pull back now from the body on the step, from the skin of blood, from the terrible tidiness of the ending, and look at the larger shape of what has happened. The empire does not collapse with Cyrus. It is too well built for that, and his son Cambyses is already in place as co-regent, prepared to inherit. The machinery holds. The satraps remain in their provinces. The royal road continues to carry messages. The system that Cyrus built with such unusual intelligence does what good systems do. It survives the death of the person who built it, at least for a while. Cambyses will conquer Egypt, which is no small thing, a genuine military achievement against one of the oldest and most formidable powers in the ancient world. The empire will continue to expand. The story is not over. But the death of Cyrus on the northeastern steppe is the first indication that the Achaemenid project carries within it a structural weakness, a flaw built into its particular genius. The flaw is this: the Persian system works brilliantly on people who want something. It works on the Babylonian priests who resent Nabonidus. It works on the Median generals who are tired of Astyages. It works on the Lydians who, once Croesus is defeated, find Persian administration perfectly acceptable. It works on every population that has grievances, that has gods it wants respected, that has a cultural identity it wants preserved, that has, in short, something to negotiate about. Cyrus is perhaps the greatest negotiator in the ancient world, and his empire is, in its deepest structure, a negotiation, a continuous, elaborate, remarkably successful offer of mutual benefit. Tomiris is not negotiating. The Massagetae are not negotiating. They do not have temples that need rebuilding or exiles that want to go home. They have the steppe, and the steppe is sufficient, and they have no interest in what Persia is selling. And, when the empire pushes past the point where its diplomatic genius can function, when it moves into territory where the population has nothing to gain from the arrangement and a very clear sense of what it stands to lose, the system has no second move. The wine trick is clever, but the wine trick is still, in the end, just a trick. It does not offer anything. It only takes. The steppe does not care about Persian administrative elegance. It does not care about the royal road, which cannot reach it. It does not care about standardized coinage or codified law, or the beautiful carvings at Persepolis, where every people of the empire is depicted in their own dignified dress. The steppe is vast and flat and indifferent, and it has been here longer than Persia and will be here after Persia is gone, and it is not impressed. It is the landscape that resists the story. It is the place where the offer expires. This will matter again. The empire that Cyrus built is, in the chapters that follow, going to keep encountering versions of this problem. The frontier that won't hold, the people who won't negotiate, the territory where the Persian genius of incorporation reaches the precise edge of its own usefulness and finds nothing on. The other side, but silence. The Greeks, when they come, will write a different story about that limit. They will make it about freedom and tyranny, about civilization and barbarism, about the West and the East in their eternal opposition, and that story will prove so compelling, so perfectly shaped for retelling, that it will outlast everything else, outlast the empire itself, outlast the civilizati on that told it. But the Greeks are not yet the point. The point, here on the northeastern steppe, in the cold clarity of 530 BC, is simpler and more instructive. The point is that even the most sophisticated system of power has a boundary. The point is that a genius for persuasion is still a genius for persuasion, and there are people who cannot be persuaded, and the wise move is to recognize them before you cross the river. The point is that Cyrus, who was almost always right about people, was wrong about this one. And the final image is not the head in the skin of blood, however memorable that image is. The final image is the steppe itself, vast, flat, indifferent, refusing to be governed, stretching east toward a horizon that the Persian Empire will never quite reach. It is waiting, as it has always waited. It is not hostile. It is simply not interested. And that, in the end, is more than enough. Inheritance is a different problem entirely. The steppe does not care what you have built. It does not read the inscriptions. It does not admire the roads or the postal relays or the clay cylinders pressed with careful words about the dignity of conquered peoples. The steppe simply is, and what it has taken, it keeps. But back inside the empire, back in Pasargadae and Babylon and Susa, where men keep records and priests maintain altars and merchants calculate the price of lapis lazuli against the weight of silver, what Cyrus has built is still standing. The question, as it always is after a great man, is what happens to it next. What happens next is Cambyses. Cambyses II inherits the Persian throne in 530 BC, and with it he inherits the army, the treasury, the administrative machinery, the diplomatic relationships, the carefully cultivated reputation for magnanimity, and approximately none of his father's instinct for when generosity is more powerful, the force. This is not to say he is stupid. He is not. He is, in fact, a competent military commander, possibly a gifted one, and the campaign he plans against Egypt is a serious piece of strategic thinking, not the impulsive lunge of a man who has simply decided he wants more, but a sophisticated combined arms operation, years in the preparation. Egypt in 525 BC is the last great independent power in the Near East, and Pharaoh Psamtik III is its ruler, newly crowned, still finding his footing. Cambyses moves against him with a fleet, a land army, and, crucially, the defection of Polycrates of Samos and the mercenary expertise of a Greek general named Phanes of Halicarnassus. A man who knows Egyptian defenses from the inside and is willing to sell that knowledge for reasons the sources lure, satisfyingly murky. The battle at Pelusium, at the eastern gate of the Nile Delta, is decisive. The Egyptians are routed, Psamtik flees, Memphis falls. Cambyses is crowned pharaoh, and in that moment, the Persian Empire has achieved something genuinely extraordinary. It now stretches from the Aegean coast to the first cataract of the Nile, a single administrative domain encompassing virtually every major civilization of the ancient world. It is an achievement that deserves a moment of acknowledgement before what follows. Cyrus conquered by consent and story. Cambyses has conquered by logistics and timing. The outcome is the same, the method is different, and that difference matters, because what follows is a masterclass in how to destroy goodwill faster than it can possibly be created. The stories about Cambyses in Egypt are, taken together, a catalogue of precisely the behaviors his father spent a lifetime scrupulously avoiding. Desecrated temples, priests mocked in their own sanctuaries, officials executed for displaying insufficient enthusiasm for their conqueror, and the story that has outlasted all the others. The Apis bull, the sacred animal of the Memphis cult, the living embodiment of Ptah himself, allegedly found by Cambyses in its festival procession and stabbed in the thigh by the Persian king in an act of contempt so theatrical it seems almost dizig, Ned to be remembered. Here the documentary's obligation to its audience requires a pause. Herodotus is our primary source for most of these stories. Herodotus, who is a magnificent writer and an enthusiastic collector of tales, and a man with a Greek's inherited suspicion of Persian intentions. The Egyptian priests who spoke to him had reasons of their own to blacken a conqueror's reputation. The Apis bull story, in particular, has been questioned by modern scholars who note that the bull in question appears, in contemporary Egyptian records, to have died of natural causes and received a proper burial. The stabbing may be invention, the mockery may be exaggeration. The desecrations may be, at least in part, the kind of story that accumulates around any foreign ruler who fails to perform the correct rituals with sufficient conviction. But here is the thing about diplomatic intelligence. You do not get credit for the atrocities you probably did not commit. You only get blamed for them. And even if half the stories about Cambyses in Egypt are Greek exaggeration, the other half is still catastrophic. Because the point is not whether he stabbed the bull. The point is that nobody, anywhere, found it implausible that he had. The point is that his father's name was carved into Egyptian memory as a servant of Marduk, a liberator of the Jews, a man who came to a conquered people and said, "Your gods are real gods, and I respect them." And Cambyses arrives in Egypt, and whatever he actually does or does not do, the story that spreads is one of contempt. The architecture of trust his father built does not survive the transition. This is what happens when you remove the diplomatic intelligence and leave the ambition running. Cambyses dies in 522 BC on his way back from Egypt, and the sources are, in their vagueness about the manner of his death, almost comically unhelpful. Herodotus says an accidental sword wound, his own thigh, in an echo of the Apis story that is either meaningful or coincidental. The wound becomes infected. He dies. Other sources suggest other possibilities: illness, conspiracy, the convenient timing of a man whose usefulness to various interested parties has expired. The ambiguity is the point. What is not ambiguous is the consequence. 19 simultaneous revolts. The empire that Cyrus stitched together across 3 decades of extraordinary effort comes apart along every seam at once. Babylon rebels, Media rebels, Persia itself rebels, the eastern satrapies rebel. 19 separate uprisings, each one a thread pulled from the same garment, each one capable on its own of consuming months of military response. Together they represent not just a political crisis, but an existential one. The first real test of whether the empire Cyrus built is a structure or a personality, whether it can survive without the man whose vision created it. Into this chaos steps Darius. He is a Persian nobleman of the royal line, distantly, or so he claims, connected to Cyrus through the Achaemenid lineage that both men invoke with the kind of careful genealogical precision that tends to appear whenever legitimacy is being constructed rather than inherited. He is one of 6 Persian nobles who move against a man named Gaumata, who has seized the throne in the confusion following Cambyses' death, claiming to be Cambyses' murdered brother, Smerdis. Whether Gaumata is actually an impostor, as Darius insists, or whether Darius himself is the impostor, remains one of the ancient world's more pleasingly unresolvable arguments. The sources for this story are almost entirely Darius's own propaganda. He wins. He writes the history. He writes it in letters cut into a cliff face at Behistun, in letters large enough to be read from the road below, in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian, so that everyone who matters can read the same account of how the gods chose him and the rebels were crushed and the world was set right. The Behistun inscription deserves a moment of its own. It is not merely a political document, though it is certainly that. It is a physical act of will. The cliff at Behistun rises nearly 300 meters above the plain, and the inscription is carved into a smooth panel at a height that required scaffolding, that required months of labor, that required Darius to decide, before the words were even chosen, that the statement he was making would be permanent and enormous and impossible to ignore. The relief sculpture above the text shows Darius with his foot on the chest of Gaumata, 9 rebel kings roped together before him, the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda floating in blessing above the scene. It is, before a single word is read, a declaration. This man intends to be believed. Whether he is telling the truth or constructing a magnificent fiction, the cliff itself is indifferent. The letters are deep. The stone is hard. The story will stand. He suppresses all 19 revolts within a year. 19. Within a year. This is a logistical achievement that borders on the implausible, even by the standards of the ancient world, and it requires not just military force, but the ability to move armies faster than rebellion can consolidate, to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously without allowing any single front to become a catastrophe, to identify which uprisings are existential and which can be contained, and to do all of this while maintaining the administrative coherence of the empire itself. It is an extraordinary performance. And this is where Darius reveals the quality that separates him from every other general of his era. He stops fighting and starts building. This is the pivot that the chapter demands, because what Darius builds is not a monument to his own glory, though there is plenty of that. What he builds is a system, and the system is the empire's greatest achievement. He divides the empire into satrapies, 20 administrative provinces, each governed by a satrap, a word that translates approximately as protector of the kingdom, each responsible for taxation, local law, and the maintenance of order within their territory. The satrap system is not, in itself, a Persian invention. The Medes and the Babylonians have used regional governors before. What Darius adds is the architecture around it, the inspectors, the royal secretaries, the military commanders who report directly to the king rather than through the satrap, the overlapping lines of accountability that prevent any single provincial governor from accumulating enough independent power to become a rival. He does not trust his administrators. He designs a system that does not require trust. The royal road runs from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in the Persian heartland. 2,700 kilometers of maintained road, with relay stations every 25 kilometers where fresh horses and fresh riders wait. A message that would take a caravan 3 months to carry arrives in 7 days. 7 days. The ancient world has nothing like it. Information moves at a speed that makes the empire governable in a way that no previous empire has managed, because the fundamental problem of large empires is not military. It is epistemic. You cannot respond to a rebellion you do not know is happening. You cannot correct a corrupt governor whose corruption you cannot document. The royal road is not a road. It is a nervous system, and Darius has given the empire one. He standardizes coinage. The gold daric, stamped with the image of a running archer. The king himself, bow drawn, eternal in his posture, becomes the currency of the known world. Merchants from Sardis to Sind can transact in the same medium. Taxes can be calculated. Tribute can be assessed. The economic life of the empire, which under Cyrus had operated on a patchwork of local weights and measures and barter arrangements, becomes legible. Numbers can be compared. Surpluses can be identified. The empire can be managed as a single economic entity, rather than a collection of local arrangements held together by reputation. And then he builds Persepolis. He begins at around 518 BC, on a terrace cut into the rock of the Marv-dashed plain in the Persian heartland, and he does not finish it. His son Xerxes and his grandson Artaxerxes will add to it for generations. But the vision is his, and the vision is unlike anything that has come before it. Persepolis is not a military installation. It is not a commercial hub. It is not a city in any conventional sense. It has no permanent civilian population, no market district, no urban sprawl extending beyond its walls. Persepolis is a statement, carved in stone and cedar and gold, about what the Persian Empire believes itself to be. The great Apadana, the audience hall at the heart of the complex, can hold 10,000 people under its cedar roof, supported by columns so tall they seem less like architecture than like a forest of stone. The staircases that lead up to it are decorated with relief sculptures in a register of quiet, almost serene formality. Delegation after delegation, 40 nations represented, each one proceeding toward the king in its own clothing, in its own posture, carrying its own tribute. Lydians with bracelets, Egyptians with a bull, Indians with a donkey, Ethiopians with an okapi, depicted with such accuracy that scholars have marveled at the observation it required, Bactrians with camels, Greeks with metal vessels. Each people rendered in their own dignity, their own identity intact in the stone, their own presence acknowledged as something real and worth depicting. There is no subordination in these carvings. There is no visual hierarchy that diminishes the delegations relative to each other. The Persians who organize the procession are slightly larger, as convention requires, but the peoples they escort are not diminished. They are simply there, present, part of the thing. It is the most explicit visual argument for something resembling cultural pluralism that the ancient world has yet produced, and it was made by a king who understood, as his father understood, as the Cyrus Cylinder announced in its careful clay, that the empire's greatest asset was not its army bull, its capacity to make every people within it feel that the arrangement was, on balance, worth maintaining. This is what Darius has built. Not just roads and coins and administrative provinces, a philosophy of empire given physical form in stone, a place where the world comes to present itself to the king, and where the king, in receiving it, acknowledges that the world is various and that its variety is not a problem to be solved, but a resource to be honored. Stand at the base of that staircase. Look up at the carved faces of 40 nations, each one distinct, each one going about the business of tribute with a kind of unhurried dignity that the sculptor has somehow preserved across 25 centuries. Lydians, Egyptians, Indians, Ethiopians, Greeks, all of them present, all of them real, all of them part of something that a man named Darius decided on a rock terrace in the Persian heartland was worth making permanent. It is an extraordinary vision. It is the vision of a man who has suppressed 19 revolts in a year and decided that the lesson of those revolts is not that subjects must be broken, but that subjects must be given reasons to stay. It is the vision of a man who looked at the empire Cyrus built on charisma and decided to build something that would outlast any single man's charisma, including his own. And it will. For another century and a half, the structure holds. But Darius is already looking west. He is already calculating the distances to the Greek cities that sheltered the Ionian rebels. He is already planning the punitive expedition that his advisors assure him will be swift and decisive. He is already, in other words, beginning to make the kind of decision that the staircase at Persepolis argues against. The decision that some people's dignity is negotiable, that some arrangements are worth breaking, that the empire's capacity for accommodation has a limit, and he has found it. The carved faces of 40 nations look out from the stone in their unhurried procession. They do not know what is coming. They simply walk, as they have always walked, toward the king who waits at the top of the stairs. And the king, for now, is still watching all of them, still counting them, still believing, with the particular confidence of a man who has never yet been wrong, that he can manage what he has built. He is not wrong about what he has built. He is beginning to be wrong about what comes next. What comes next is a story, and the story, it turns out, is the problem. The Persian Wars, as they are known in the Western tradition, are one of history's most consequential acts of narrative theft. This is not a comfortable thing to say, and it requires some care, because the word theft implies that the Greeks fabricated what happened, and they did not. The battles are real. The burning of Athens is real. The dead at Thermopylae are real, and they deserve every elegy ever written for them. But there is a difference between what happens and what a particular set of survivors choose to make of it, and in the case of the Persian Wars, that difference is approximately the size of Western civilization's self-image. So let us, for a moment, set aside the mythology, not to diminish it, but to see it clearly. Let us look at what actually occurs from the side that does not get to write the history. From a Persian strategic perspective, the sequence of events that the Greeks will call the Persian Wars begins not with tyranny reaching westward across the Aegean, but with a local administrative problem. The Greek cities along the Aegean coast of Anatolia, Miletus, Ephesus, the cluster of prosperous palace that make up the region the Greeks call Ionia, have been part of the Persian imperial system since Cyrus absorbed the Lydian kingdom in the 540s BC. They pay tribute. They provide ships. They are, by the standards of the empire, reasonably well governed. Their local customs are respected. Their temples stand. By the late 6th century, they have been Persian subjects for the better part of 2 generations, which is long enough that the arrangement has become, for most of them, simply the arrangement. In 499 BC, they revolt. The reasons are complicated. There are grievances, real ones, involving tribute rates, and the ambitions of a particular Milesian tyrant named Aristagoras, who has made promises he cannot keep, and is now looking for an exit strategy that does not involve his own execution. Aristagoras sails to mainland Greece and asks for help. Sparta sensibly declines. Athens, less sensibly, sends 20 ships. Eretria sends 5. It is not, by any military measure, a serious intervention. But it is enough to encourage the rebels, and in 498 BC, the combined Greek force marches inland and burns Sardis, the old Lydian capital and the seat of Persian power in the west. Darius hears about this. According to Herodotus, he asks who the Athenians are, is told, and then asks a servant to remind him of them 3 times a day at dinner. The story is almost certainly apocryphal, but it captures something true about the Persian perspective, which is that Athens, at this moment, is not a civilization. It is a city that has just burned a provincial capital and then retreated. Darius does not need a servant to remind him of his enemies. He needs generals, and he has them. The revolt is suppressed by 493 BC. It takes 6 years, which is longer than it should, and the final punishment of Miletus, the city sacked, its population deported, is genuinely brutal. The empire does not pretend otherwise. Punishment is part of the logic of imperial administration, and the logic is explicit. There are consequences for rebellion, because without consequences there is no order, and without order there is no empire. The Greeks in Ionia understand this. Most of them, when the revolt collapses, simply return to being Persian subjects. The tribute resumes. The ships are rebuilt. Life continues. Darius then does exactly what any competent imperial administrator would do. He sends a punitive expedition against the cities on the Greek mainland that aided the rebels. This is measured. This is proportionate. By the standards of the ancient world, this is restrained. The expedition of 490 BC, commanded by Datis and Artaphernes, crosses the Aegean, takes the island of Naxos, sacks Eretria, deports its population, and then lands on the coast of Attica at a place called Marathon. What happens next is where the story begins to escape Persian control. The Athenians, outnumbered and without the Spartan reinforcements they have requested, advance. This alone is unusual enough to note. Greek hoplites, heavy infantry in tight formation, typically wait to receive a charge rather than initiate one. But Miltiades, the Athenian general who has spent years in the Persian service and understands Persian tactics with uncomfortable intimacy, does something unexpected. He weakens his center and strengthens his wings. The Persian cavalry, for reasons that still generate historical debate. Perhaps they have been remounted and are not yet in position. Perhaps the timing simply catches them disorganized, does not engage. And when the Athenian wings crash into the Persian flanks and fold inward, the battle becomes, with startling speed, a rout. The Persians lose perhaps 6,000 men. The Athenians lose fewer than 200. The expedition withdraws. By any strategic measure, this is a setback, a failed punitive mission that will need to be revisited with greater resources. Artaphernes, the Persian commander, has made a tactical error and paid for it. He knows this. Darius knows this. The empire knows this. The expedition has not achieved its objective. and the objective will need to be achieved by other means with a larger army at a later date. What the Persians do not know, cannot know, is what the Athenians are already beginning to make of it. The story Athens tells about Marathon is not the story of a tactical error by a mid-ranking Persian general on a secondary expedition. It is the story of the moment the free citizens of a democratic city stood against the infinite armies of Oriental despotism and, through courage and ingenuity, turned the tide of history. It is the story of the birth of the West. Every detail of the battle is preserved, embellished, mythologized. The messenger who runs from the battlefield to Athens to announce the victory and then dies of his exertion. A story almost certainly invented, but too perfect to abandon. The Athenians who fought there will call themselves marathon fighters for the rest of their lives, and their children will call them that, and their children's children. A military engagement involving perhaps 20,000 men on a coastal plain becomes, in the Greek imagination, the hinge on which civilization turns. This is, to be precise, a significant proportional mismatch, and it is only the beginning. Darius dies in 486 BC before he can mount the larger expedition he has planned. His son Xerxes inherits the obligation along with the throne, and in 480 BC, Xerxes crosses the Hellespont with an army that Herodotus, with his customary enthusiasm for large numbers, estimates at over 2 million men. Modern historians suggest something closer to 200,000, which is still, by ancient standards, an extraordinary force. The largest coordinated military operation the world has yet seen. Xerxes has built a bridge of boats across the strait between Asia and Europe. He has cut a canal through the peninsula of Athos to protect his fleet from coastal storms. He has been planning this campaign for 4 years. He is not, whatever the later mythology suggests, a foolish man. He is a king who has taken a serious strategic problem seriously. The campaign goes well at first. Thermopylae is a Greek tactical success and a Persian strategic victory. The pass falls, the Greek defensive line collapses, and the road to Athens opens. The city is evacuated. The Persians enter and burn it. This is not incidental. The burning of Athens is deliberate, and it is an atrocity, and the chapter that contains it should not soften that word. The temples on the Acropolis, some of them still under construction, are destroyed. The city that has made itself the story of Greek freedom is reduced to ash by the king who, in that story, represents everything freedom opposes. It is a genuine catastrophe. And then, Salamis. The Greek fleet, under the command of the Athenian Themistocles, has retreated into the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Attic coast. Themistocles has spent months arguing, against considerable resistance, that the navy is Athens' real defense, that the wooden walls the oracle at Delphi has promised are ships, not walls, and that the right place to fight the Persian fleet is somewhere the Persian fleet's numerical advantage become a liability rather than an asset. He is, on the question of naval tactics, correct in a way that very few people are correct about anything. The strait at Salamis is too narrow for a large fleet to maneuver. The Persian ships, trying to advance in formation, become entangled with each other. The Greek triremes, lighter and more maneuverable, pick them apart. Xerxes watches from a throne on the shore. He has had the throne placed there deliberately to observe his fleet's victory and to be seen observing it. What he observes instead is a catastrophe. Ship after ship, driven onto rocks or rammed by Greek prows, the surface of the water thick with wreckage and men. The Persian fleet does not simply lose, it disintegrates. Xerxes retreats. He leaves a substantial army in Greece under his general Mardonius, which will be defeated at Plataea the following year. The Persian withdrawal from Greece is complete by 479 BC. From a Persian strategic perspective, this is a military setback, not an existential crisis. The empire loses nothing it cannot afford to lose. a few Aegean islands, some prestige, a great deal of timber and bronze from the wrecked fleet at Salamis. The tribute still flows from 40 nations. The royal road still carries its messages. The satraps still govern. The empire that Darius built is not shaken by the loss of a naval engagement in a secondary theater on its western frontier. What it loses that cannot be recovered is the narrative. Here is where the dry irony of this particular chapter of history becomes almost too much to bear without comment. In 472 BC, 8 years after Salamis, the Athenian playwright Aeschylus stages a tragedy called The Persians. It is, by any measure, a remarkable work. Aeschylus himself fought at Marathon. He may have fought at Salamis. He is not a disinterested party. And yet the play he writes is not a celebration of Greek triumph. It is a portrait of the Persian court in mourning, of Xerxes' mother Atossa receiving the news of the disaster at Salamis, of the ghost of Darius rising from the dead to lament his son's hubris, of Xerxes himself returning in rags, the magnificence of his departure, now a bitter irony. The Persians in Aeschylus grieve with recognizable human dignity. Their grief is not comic, it is not contemptible. It is the grief of people who have lost something real, and Aeschylus renders it with a sympathy that is, given the circumstances, almost startling. Almost. Because there is something else happening in the Persians that is worth naming. The play is performed in Athens. The audience is Athenian. The theater in which it is staged sits in the city that Xerxes burned and that has rebuilt itself with the particular energy of a people who have been given a story worth telling more gloriously than before. The Persians are human in Aeschylus. They suffer. They mourn. They speak lines that an Athenian audience can recognize as the lines of people rather than monsters. But they are also absent. They are present on the stage as a projection of Greek imagination, filtered through Greek language, shaped by Greek dramatic convention, and offered to a Greek audience as a mirror in which Greece sees its own values reflected and confirmed. The most generous Greek account of Persia is still an account written by a Greek, for Greeks, about what it means to be Greek. The Persians, across the Aegean, are not in the theater. They are not consulted. They do not know that this is how they are being remembered, and if they knew, they would find the category confusing. The idea that a civilization's meaning could be determined by the plays staged in a city it once burned is not a Persian way of thinking about power. This is, perhaps, the deepest irony of all. The Persians understand administration. They understand tribute and roads and the management of diverse peoples across vast distances. They understand that an empire is held together by systems, not stories, and they have built their systems with a sophistication that will not be matched for centuries. What they do not understand, what the empire's entire architecture is not designed to address, is the possibility that the people they fail to conquer will be the people who define them, that the narrative is a kind of power, that the story, once it calcifies, is harder to move than an army. From 479 BC onward, the story of Persia in Western memory is the story of the invasions, of Thermopylae and Salamis, of the heroic Greek resistance to Oriental despotism, of freedom standing against the infinite and implacable East, the story of everything else. The Cyrus Cylinder, the Royal Road, the Persepolis reliefs, the 2 centuries of remarkably sophisticated multi-ethnic governance, is buried under the weight of what the Greeks choose to remember and choose to write down. The Persian record of its own achievements exists. It is carved in stone, in 3 languages, on a cliff face at Behistun. It is pressed into clay cylinders and buried under foundation walls. It is present in every relief at Persepolis, where a delegation from a distant nation walks toward the king with its own dignity intact. But stone does not travel as far as words, and clay cylinders stay buried for 2,000 years, and the relief carvings at Persepolis will eventually be burned. The final image of this chapter is not a battlefield, it is a theater. Athens, the city that Xerxes burned, has rebuilt itself with a particular magnificence. The Parthenon is going up on the Acropolis, white marble against the sky, a monument to the idea that Athens is the city that survived, the city that was chosen by history, the city whose story is the story of sea, evilization itself. In the theater below, an audience of citizens sits in the open air and watches plays about what they have been through and what it means. They are rapt. The stories they are hearing will be repeated, copied, translated, argued over, and built upon for the next 2,500 years. Across the Aegean, the Persian Empire is administering 40 nations. Messages are moving along the royal road. Satraps are hearing disputes and collecting tribute and reporting to the king. The machinery of the most sophisticated administrative system the ancient world has yet produced is turning, quietly and efficiently, as it has been turning for decades and will continue to turn for a century and a half more. Neither group is paying much attention to the other, but only one of them is writing it down, and only one of them, in the long memory of the civilization that follows, will be remembered as the point of the story. The Persians have lost the narrative. They do not yet know that the narrative is what lasts. After Salamis, the Persian Empire does not decline, not immediately, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to a traveler moving along the royal road in the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era. The satrapies function, the tribute flows. The relay riders carry their dispatches from Sardis to Susa in a week. The delegations come to Persepolis. The empire is, by almost every practical measure, the most successful political enterprise the ancient world has produced. And for another 150 years, it will continue to be so, weathering succession crises and palace intrigues, and the occasional satrap who decides his province is large, enough to be a kingdom. What the empire cannot weather, in the end, is a man who arrives from the outside and understands it better than it understands itself. Consider what that traveler on the royal road actually sees in 460 BC. He moves through a world that has been engineered for movement. The road surface is maintained. The caravanserais are spaced at intervals that account for the pace of a loaded donkey. At each station, water is available, fodder is available, and the royal dispatches have already moved through, carried by riders who hand off their satchels like a relay without slowing. A system so efficient that the Greeks, who have nothing remotely like it, will spend decades marveling at it and never quite manage to replicate it. The traveler passes through provinces that speak different languages, worship different gods, wear different clothes, and yet all function within the same administrative membrane, paying in standardized coin, measured by standardized weights, adjudicated by laws that carry the king's seal. The empire's genius is not that it erases difference. Its genius is that it has found a way to make difference profitable. This is the inheritance Xerxes leaves behind when the Greek adventure ends and he turns his attention back to the vast majority of his empire that is not Greece. He does not return diminished in any structural sense. The treasury is full, the roads are intact, the satrapies report. What has been damaged is something harder to quantify. A kind of confidence in the empire's invincibility, a slight loosening of the certainty that Achaemenid expansion is simply the direction history moves. Xerxes retreats into his palace at Persepolis and Susa, into a court life of extraordinary luxury, and is assassinated in 465 BC by his own vizier. His son Artaxerxes one takes the throne after a brief and violent family negotiation of the kind that will become increasingly familiar. And here the narration must resist a temptation. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to treat every king after Xerxes as evidence of decay, to read the succession crises as symptoms of a dying empire rather than what they actually are, which is the ordinary friction of any hereditary system navigating the gap between the institutional genius required to build something and the considerably more modest talents required to maintain it. Artaxerxes I is not a great king. He's a competent one. He keeps the machine running. He suppresses a revolt in Egypt. He negotiates a peace with Athens, the Peace of Callias, 449 BC, that effectively ends the Persian-Greek conflict on terms that are, if not favorable to Persia, at least not humiliating. The tribute flows, the road moves dispatches, the delegations come. The problem is not any individual king. The problem is structural, and it is the same problem that haunts every empire built on the particular genius of its founders. Darius designed a system calibrated for a king who was simultaneously a military commander, an administrator, a theologian, and a politician. A king who could hold the whole of it in his head and see where the tensions were building before they became crises. Exceptional kings are, by definition, rare. The system does not stop working when ordinary men inherit it, but it stops being tight. The satrapies governed with genuine local autonomy because that was the innovation, because that was what distinguished Persian rule from the blunt instrument of Assyrian occupation, begin over generations to develop their own centers of gravity. A satrap who governs a province for 20 years, who builds relationships with local elites, who commands his own army and collects his own revenue, is not simply an administrator anymore. He is a power. The royal road still carries dispatches from the center, but the dispatches are increasingly requests rather than commands, and the distinction matters. By the time Darius II takes the throne in 423 BC, following yet another succession crisis, the satrapal system's failure modes are becoming visible, not catastrophically, not in ways that interrupt the tribute or close the roads, but in the way that a building's foundation, settling unevenly, will begin to show hairline fractures in the plaster of upper floors long before anyone worries about structural integrity. Satraps fight each other. Satraps hire Greek mercenaries, which is itself a remarkable development. The empire that once mobilized the ancient world's largest army is now, routinely, supplementing its forces with soldiers from the civilization it spent decades trying to absorb. The center still holds, but it holds through habit as much as through structure, and the difference between those two things is a difference that only becomes visible when something genuinely new arrives to test it. The genuinely new thing is not Alexander. Not yet. The genuinely new thing is Philip II of Macedon, and the Persian court's failure to read him correctly is one of history's more consequential intelligence failures. Philip inherits a small, semi-barbarous kingdom on the northern fringe of the Greek world in 359 BC, a kingdom the sophisticated city-states of Athens and Thebes consider barely worth noticing. He proceeds with a methodical and unglamorous genius to reorganize it entirely. He reforms the Macedonian army into a professional force built around the sarissa, a pike of extraordinary length that transforms the dynamics of a phalanx engagement in ways that take his opponents years to understand and counter. He builds roads. He develops mines. He conducts patient, decade-long diplomatic campaigns that isolate his enemies from each other before he moves against them militarily. He is not charismatic in the way that Alexander will be charismatic. He is something in some ways more dangerous. He is systematic. The Persian court watches Philip's rise with the mild interest of a great power observing a regional disturbance. They are not wrong to note that Philip's Macedonia is not, in any direct sense, a threat to Persia. They are catastrophically wrong to conclude from this that Philip is not a threat. What Philip is building is not an army capable of matching Persia. What Philip is building is a unified Greek world, or unified enough, unified at sword point and treaty, both, that could, under the right leadership, project force eastward in a way that the fractious, perpetually squabbling Greek city-states of the previous century never could. The Persians have spent 100 years learning to manage Greek disunity. They have not prepared for Greek coherence. Philip is assassinated in 336 BC at his own daughter's wedding by a bodyguard whose motives remain contested. He dies before he can launch the eastern campaign he has been planning. His son is 20 years old, and the Persian court, receiving this news, almost certainly exhales. A young king, untested, inheriting a volatile coalition army and a half-planned war. The threat, such as it was, has probably resolved itself. The young king's name is Alexander. He crosses into Asia in 334 BC with an army of roughly 40,000 men, a force that is, by Persian standards, almost insultingly small. The empire can field armies that dwarf it. The empire has resources that make it look negligible. What the empire does not have and cannot manufacture is what Alexander brings with him. A unity of command so complete that his army functions as a single instrument of his will, and a tactical intuition so acute that he can read a battlefield in the moment it is happening and find the hinge point, the place where a concentrated strike will cause a structure 10 times his size to collapse. At the Granicus River, the Persian commanders make the mistake of fighting on Alexander's terms, a direct engagement, cavalry against cavalry, in which Alexander's personal courage and his army's professional cohesion prove decisive. It is not a crushing defeat for Persia. It is a signal. At Issus in 333 BC, Darius III himself commands, and the army he brings is overwhelming in its numbers, and the numbers do not matter. Alexander finds the seam between the Persian center and its left flank, and drives through it with the companion cavalry like a wedge. And the Persian line does not bend, it shatters, and Darius flees the field in his chariot while his family, his mother, his wife, his daughters are captured. Alexander treats them with conspicuous courtesy. He is performing something. He is performing Persian royal legitimacy for an audience that includes every Persian noble, watching to see what kind of king this is. The irony accumulates with each mile he moves east. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, the last great set-piece battle, Darius has chosen a flat plain specifically to neutralize Alexander's tactical advantages, has had the ground leveled for his scythed chariots, has assembled an army so large it reportedly requires the entire night to deploy. And Alexander, who has spent the night sleeping, calmly, infuriatingly sleeping, wakes up and does the same thing he has done twice before. He finds the gap, he goes through it. Darius flees again, and this time there is no reconstituting the army, no regrouping behind a defensible line. The empire's military capacity is exhausted. But watch what Alexander does as he moves through the Persian heartland. He does not dismantle the satrapal system. He appoints his own satraps, some Macedonian, some Persian, and instructs them to govern as Darius governed, to maintain local custom, to respect local religion, to administer through existing structures. He visits Cyrus's tomb at Pasargadae and orders it restored and protected. He adopts Persian court dress. He begins requiring Persian-style prostration from visitors, which horrifies his Macedonian generals in a way that no amount of bloodshed has managed to horrify them, because prostration is, to Greek eyes, the physical enactment of slavery, the visible sign of everything they have spent a century tar. Ling themselves, they are not. Alexander does not care. He has looked at the Persian administrative system and recognized it for what it is, the most sophisticated instrument of governance the ancient world has produced, and he wants it. He wants it badly enough to become it. The burning of Persepolis in 330 BC, whether calculated symbolism, drunken impulse, or some combustible mixture of both, is the one act that cannot be absorbed into this narrative of adoption. The palace complex that Darius built, where the carved delegations of 30 nations bring their tribute in perpetual stone procession, burns for days. Alexander reportedly regrets it almost immediately. He should. He has destroyed the physical monument of the thing he is trying to become. But the administrative reality, the roads, the relay system, the satrapal structure, the habits of governance embedded in 1,000 officials across 1,000,000 square miles, that does not burn. You cannot burn a habit. Darius III does not die at Persepolis. He flees east into Bactria, pursued by Alexander with a relentlessness that is almost personal. He is not a bad king, Darius III. He is a man who inherited a system in its late afternoon, who faced a challenge that no system calibrated for the management of ordinary problems could have handled, and who fought with what he had until what he had was gone. He is not a coward, though the Greeks will call him one. He is a man who twice made the rational decision to preserve his life and his capacity to resist, and who is finally overtaken not by Alexander but by his own satrap, Bessus, who murders him in 330 BC in the dust of a Bactrian road and proclaims himself king. Alexander arrives at the body. The sources agree on what he does next, even if they cannot agree on much else. He takes his own cloak, a Macedonian cloak, worn by the man who has spent the past 4 years systematically dismantling everything the Achaemenid dynasty built, and he lays it over Darius. He orders a royal burial. He calls Bessus a traitor and will hunt him down with a particular fury that suggests the murder has genuinely offended him, not as a military matter, but as a violation of something he considers sacred. It is the gesture of a man who understands legitimacy, the way Cyrus understood it, as a story that must be told correctly, as a performance that must be executed with conviction, as a cloak that can be transferred but not simply discarded. Alexander does not want to be the man who killed the Persian Empire. He wants to be the man who inherited it. He wants, in the deepest possible sense, to be Cyrus, to stand at the end of a conquest and say that nothing has been destroyed, that everything has simply been absorbed, that the wheel of empire has turned, and he is now the center around which it turns. The Achaemenid line ends not with a battle, but with a betrayal, not with a foreign sword, but with a Persian one. The man who arrives to mourn the last Persian king is the man who destroyed everything the first Persian king built. And yet the mourning is real, or real enough to matter, and the cloak is real, and the burial is real, and what they signify is real, that the empire Cyrus built on the idea that conquered peoples deserve dignity, and gods deserve respect and administration is a more durable instrument than terror. That empire has been recognized, even by its destroyer, as the template against which everything that follows will be measured. Persia falls. But this is not the end of Persia. The Seleucid kings who inherit Alexander's Eastern Empire will govern through Persian administrative structures because there is no better alternative. The Parthians, Iranian themselves, will rule for 4 centuries and understand themselves as the heirs of Achaemenid legitimacy. The Sasanians will revive the royal title, the royal iconography, the royal theology, and rule another 4 centuries more. The idea of Iran, of a people defined by a plateau, a language, a particular genius for administration and accommodation, does not require the Achaemenid dynasty to survive. It requires only that the habits of mind Cyrus established and Darius systematized, and the 100 lesser kings maintained well enough to keep the roads open and the tribute flowing, be recognized as worth preserving. Alexander wraps Darius III in his cloak and orders a royal burial, and in doing so, he tells us everything we need to know about what the Persian Empire actually was. It was not the enemy of civilization. It was not the tyrannical monolith that Greek playwrights and Athenian orators constructed for their own rhetorical purposes. It was the civilization, the largest, most administratively sophisticated, most religiously tolerant political organism the ancient world had yet produced, a system so impressive that the man who conquered it immediately wanted to wear it, so durable that it outlasted its own destruction by century. So foundational that we are still, in ways we rarely acknowledge, living inside its inheritance. The long afternoon of the Persian Empire ends in the dust of a Bactrian road, covered in a Macedonian cloak. But the sun that cast that long shadow does not set, it simply moves, and the world it illuminated. the world of roads and laws and administrative tolerance, and the radical idea that an empire can hold not by breaking the peoples inside it, but by making room for them. That world does not end with the Achaemenids. It continues, as it has always continued, in every civilization sophisticated enough to understand that the most durable thing a king can build is not a wall, and not a tomb, and not even a road. It is a system that works well enough that the man who conquers you decides to keep it running. Persia fell, but Persia endured.